Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo. And specifically, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at how to import the data from our users.csv into an array list of collected info. Now, this video assumes that you have watched some earlier videos, particularly those focusing on the file reader, the buffered reader, the use of arrays to be able to store imported data, as well as understanding and having watched the videos on the array list. So without too much further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. And the first thing that we can do to help us along is to take a look at the existing function for the import info from CSV using arrays. And this will sort of give us a template or some guidance on what we're trying to do. You'll note, first of all, that this function has a return value of an array of collected info and accepts no input argument. It also has a file reader, and buffered reader objects that we will use to sort of triage and have a little bit of logic to determine whether or not the file exists, and so on, as well as variables to hold the contents of a line, the chunks associated with separating out the individual pieces of data that were separated by commas, and then some additional variables that are used to help us navigate the array. Well, in this particular case, the function we want to use will return an array list. And so if anything, what you want to do is compare and contrast these two methods so you can appreciate the differences between the array and the array list. So let's get started. We'll have a public static function again, and the return type for this one will be java.util.ArrayList, where the type of the data that's going to be stored in the array list will be EE333.collectedInfo. The name of the function or method will be a little bit on the long side. It will be ImportInfo from CSV using array lists. And again, it's going to accept no input arguments because we are going to rely on a static, or rather hard-coded, file named users.csv. At this point, we can go ahead and provide the comment block up top, as well as providing the return value so that we have working code. Again, it will be a java.util.ArrayList, and specifically an array list of type, or rather holds the type EE333.collectedInfo. Keep with the pattern that we used earlier. We're going to call it results. And then again, we're going to use our constructor on our java.util.ArrayList. And we'll specify again in the constructor that it needs to be containing or holding EE333.collectedInfo. All that with the parentheses to indicate that we are passing no arguments to this constructor. And then lastly, we have our return results. And so at this point, our function will at least return an empty array list. Now you could argue we could also do null within the calling function, would have to check to see if the return value is null. And so this is probably, if anything, a better pattern to use. Now, at this point, what we want to do is, again, sort of use guidance from the previous version of this function to go ahead and declare several variables that we're going to need here. And those are going to be the java.io.file that we're going to call input file, the java.io.file reader, which will allow for us to read the contents of the file, and then the java.io.buffered reader that will allow for us some additional functionality to read the contents of the file line by line. Now, if you've not yet watched those earlier videos, I highly encourage you to do so because it's a little simpler of an example, and it'll get you started on using the file reader and the buffered reader. In addition, we also need a couple of variables, Java lang.string as a line. And the idea is that's going to contain an entire line of information captured from the buffered reader, as well as an array of chunks that will represent each piece of information separated by the commas. So the idea is that we're going to use the line, break it up based on the commas into separate chunks, and then store it into our chunks variable. At this point, we may need other variables, but we can go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to do is to go ahead and initialize now our input file, and our input file, calling the constructor or the java.io.file, we will simply just hard code in users.csv. Again, the assumption is that we're using a single file here, both for exporting and importing. At this point, then we can write a little bit of logic here around our input file and to check to see whether or not it does exist. And if it does exist, well, then we can go ahead and attempt to open it or try to open it, and then ultimately parse it. But if it does not exist, then, or under the else branch of our if else, then we simply want to provide some sort of message back to the user indicating what has gone wrong. And so we're going to say error, no users.csv is available, or again, some sort of friendly message to the user to indicate what the problem is. Now, at this point, we need to attempt to open it, or probably better to go ahead and emphasize this, we're going to try to open it, which implies then that we need our try-catch block. And the try-catch blocks will always surround any attempt to open a file. And we will catch, in this case, a generic exception. And we'll do two things here. We will go ahead and print out some sort of message that we craft. So using the print line, and possibly even something along lines or as generic as error, something went wrong. Although you would probably want to try to use a little more description here, but we can refine that later. And then system.out.println, whatever was provided to us by our exception. In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage that toString method in our exception. Now, at this point in the try block, we want to go ahead and use our input file reader. We're going to call the constructor for it. A little minor detail here. I'll go ahead and change the capitalization. But we want to go ahead and call the constructor for our java.io.file reader. And if you recall, we had a couple of different overloads where we could pass either the string to the file name or a file object. Since we happen to already have the file object, we're going to leverage that. And then you always want to remember, whenever you open a file, to remember to close it. And so at some point, you want to go ahead and put that code in, perhaps almost immediately would be a good idea. The next step then will be for us to use our input buffered reader. And again, we're going to call the constructor this time for the java.io.buffer reader. And you'll see that we've got a couple of options, but particularly we're interested in using a reader to be able to then buffer the input from the file. And so in this case, we're going to then use our input file reader. And again, we want to remember to close these, if anything, in the reverse order in which we have opened them. Now, at this point, just a quick reminder, if we leverage our input buffered reader, we have the ability to call a read line method. And that read line method will do exactly what it sounds like it'll do. It'll read everything up to the end of line character, and then it'll return it as a string. This is the advantage of the input buffered reader over the input file reader, where we would have to pull the characters out of the file one by one. And so as such, what we want to do is we want to store the output of the call to the read line function in our line variable. And then we simply wrap all of this in a while loop using an extra set of parentheses here, making sure that we've got them paired up nicely. And basically, while this is not equal to null, we can assume that we are successfully reading data from the file line by line. Now, please note, if you have a zero length string in your file, this will not trip the null condition in the while loop. So being end of file and just having a zero length string being pulled by your read line is not the same thing. This will return null when there's either some sort of error or some issue with the file, a real issue with the file, or end of file. At this point now, we can take this line and we can break it into its chunks by simply calling the split method of our string variable or string object. And for the delimiter, well, it just happens to be a comma. And so this will allow for us to split the data by the delimiter. And at this point, we just need to count the number of columns that we would expect in this CSV file. We've done this earlier. I encourage you to also recheck your users.csv. But in this case, we know that we have 11 columns of data. And so if our chunks.length is equal to 11, what we're going to do is assume that we have 11 fields of valid data. Now, the truth is that we want to do much more in terms of validation than this. In other words, we wouldn't want to have a zero length Blazor ID or user ID and so on, but we're going to leave that for a later video. And then under the else branch, we simply want to go ahead and provide then a statement to the user using system.out.println error, or even a warning that an unhandled number of columns was returned. However you want to word this again, this is just meant to convey information back to the user. And probably an additional thing to point out is that you are skipping that row of information. At this point, then, it's just a little bit of management on your part to remember which one of the columns corresponds to which one of the fields. However, we need a temporary place to be able to store that information as we are assembling it. So we're actually going to need one more variable. And so in addition to the array list of results, we are also going to need an individual result, which we're going to call result singular, and it is going to be of type EE333.collectedInfo. And at this point, we can just simply set that equal to null, or for that matter, not even bother to initialize it at all. The idea is that we're going to use that singular result over and over again every time we find the appropriate number of chunks in the file or in the line of the file that we have read. And so we can start off by simply saying result then is going to be equal to new EE333.collectedInfo. And again, we have a parameterless constructor. We'll talk more in a later video about why that's probably a bad idea, but for right now, we're simply going to leave this as is. This will allow for us to create and then initialize our EE333 collected info object. And you can have a little bit of solace in knowing that in this parameterless constructor, we are at least setting default values for each one of the fields. Again, this is not the way that we would want to do this long term. But now what we can do is we can field by field say result with a singular dot blazer ID is going to be equal to chunks square bracket 0. And why did I know that? Well, it just happens to be the 0th column, or however you want to look at it, the first column in the file, the 0th element in the chunks array. And we will simply just go through this field by field. The first name is going to be equal to chunks square brackets 1. And I am going to go ahead and cheat just a little bit here to speed this up. I'm actually going to modify this slightly so that I can just put one character in there. Go a little faster. So results dot last name, or result dot last name. This is the singular result. And that's going to be the third column, or index 2. The initials. I apologize, I keep tabbing too quickly and it is assuming something that I don't want. So let's slow down just slightly here. So there's our initials. The next one is going to be the languages. That is going to be equal to chunks square brackets 4. Result dot goals for the class, chunks square brackets 5. And hopefully at this point, you see the pattern of what we're trying to do here. There's our professional goals. And if anything, this is probably just a little extra repetition. We have our graduation, which resides in our 8th column, or index 7. And then we have the information about our computer, starting with the computer model. In the 9th location, the computer model, or rather the computer CPU. In the 10th, and then the computer memory in the 11th position. Now, at this point, assuming that all of the fields are valid, which again, we do want to do some additional validation. Matter of fact, I'm going to put a little note in here. To do, must do some additional validation based on the fields. But we have a fully constructed result object, and it's a result object is of type EE333.collectedInfo. And now what we want to do is we want to add this to our array list. And well, it is exactly as simple as it sounds. And that is going to be, say, results.add. And you'll notice that this time around, it specifies that the object to be added will be of type collected info. And so we simply say results.add, and we add the individual result from an iteration in our loop. The idea is that this will happen over and over again until we run out of lines in the file, or rather until we run out of valid lines in the file. And what I mean by valid lines is that a line must be able to be separated into 11 chunks. We close the buffered reader, we close the file reader, and we return our results. So let's go ahead and build this to make sure that we've got working Java code. Let's go up to our main. If anything, what we can do now is we can get a little more guidance again from our import info from CSV using arrays. And we will start another branch of our if else if. For our argument count, we simply have to have one argument. The switch that will indicate which function that we wish to call. And in this case, it's going to be our import info from CSV using array lists. And if that's equal to true, well, then we simply go ahead and create a local variable to this branch of our else if. We are again going to call it results. This time around, though, it will be of type java.util.ArrayList, and specifically it'll be an array list that holds our EE333 collected info. Again, we're going to call this results. We do not have to initialize it because we're going to assume now that the function returns an initialized array list. You could consider still doing some null checking. However, though, based on the fact that we wrote the function that we are about to call, we would at least have a 0-length array list. So we say results are equal to EE333.FundamentalsDemo.import. And in this case, it's going to be import from CSV using array lists. And then to prove that we've actually accomplished something, then we have to enumerate through the elements of our array list. And we can do this both with a for loop as well as a for each loop. And just as a quick reminder, what we're going to do is we're going to do both of them. And so this will be a for loop. We're also going to do a for each loop. And the idea then is that we simply demonstrate that our objects are fully populated. So to do the for loop, we simply say for index equals to 0, index less than results dot size. Size will tell you the number of elements in the array list. And then we simply increment the index. And then inside of this for loop, we simply leverage our system.out.println. We could also leverage our printf if we wish to. And for each one of the results, we simply call results parentheses, or rather results.get parentheses, and we specify the index of the result we're interested in, and we follow it up with the toString method associated with an individual element in that array list. And so it's very important to note here that this toString is not the toString for the results array list. It is the toString that we wrote in an individual collected info. In other words, we can test this. As a matter of fact, it would be good for us to appreciate this. We could technically, for instance, make a call using results.get. Again, the index, no difference there. But if you'll notice, we have our toCSV as well as our toCustom. So in other words, you can print this out in whatever format you would like to. So either of those will be fine. And then the other thing that we'd like to include in here, just because we have access to it, is going to be our index. And so I'm going to precede this then with an index, again, colon, and then simply add the value of the index on a separate line. And this is the advantage, of course, with doing the for loop with the index. Now, in contrast to this, then we could also do a for each loop, which would then allow for us to use an iterator variable. And in this case, it will be of type collected info, and we can call it either result, we could call it something else, or we could call it iterator. just for convenience. And we will use then the results to be able to iterate through the results. And again, what we can do is a system.out.println. And what we will do is we will leverage our iterator local variable. And again, you'll notice that I have all of the fields as well as all of the methods associated with a collected info object. In this case, I'm just going to use the toString. Again, I would encourage you to play around with it because you can see that you can actually iterate through and just print it out in a CSV format as well, the same as what we were doing to print it to a file. And I guess probably about the only other thing that I would do between these two, just so you could see a partition, is include a system.out.println, and then again, just some sort of border between the two. At this point, let's go ahead and build it. Let's go over to your command line. Verify that you are in the right location. We are in our classes folder, so we're going to run our Java EE333.FundamentalsDemo. We're going to pass it the switch of import info from CSV using array lists. And at this point, you should see data coming flying past you on the screen, quite a bit of it. Matter of fact, there's our index 0 element of our CSV file. I'm going to try to pull this up so you can see it simultaneously. There's my 0th element, or my first row in the file, my second row in the file, and you can see that I've just changed the Blazor ID. The rest of the information is pretty much the same. Hopefully I've mapped them correctly. And then you can come down here and you'll see that we're getting the same behavior. Of course, this time around, we do not have access to the index. Doesn't matter really which way you go about doing it. If you are in need of the index, in other words, you want to know where the element is in the array list, then I would encourage you to use a for loop. Otherwise, you can use a for each loop. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.